So, if you've ever walked out of an interview wondering what just happened, or if you're a hiring manager who keeps interviewing candidates but still struggles to pick the right person, this episode is for you. Today, we're going to expose why most job interviews don't actually predict success on the job and what both candidates and employers can do to make this process far more meaningful. David Cohen is back. He's the founder of DS Cohen and Associates, and he helps organizations improve leadership, hiring, and workplace performance. He's written a few books, one of which is behind me called Selecting the Best. And today we're going to do something a little bit different. So we're going to be doing a mock interview where I'm preparing for an interview. David's going to interview me, and then we're going to talk about what works and what doesn't in the hopes that we can help anyone out there in organizations in these roles with the hiring process so that you can have a really successful workplace. David, it's really good to see you.
Great to see you again.
Yeah, we were just talking about the weather and how we're done with this. It's like Canadians, we put up with winter for half of the year, it feels like it's cold.
It's cold again, but we've got a teaser where it was really warm for a few days. So we'll see what happens next. You
Yeah,
never
it
know.
kind of smells like spring.
Yep. And it was feeling like spring, but it's going to snow later today.
So today you're going to be interviewing me. So
Yes, I am.
what is the passion or thought behind this? What are you hoping for the audience to get out of this episode?
I'm hoping that the audience will get two messages. First message is for the hiring manager that a lot of these classic questions, which we'll go through in the beginning, really are useless. They don't give any information of how the person will actually perform in the job, but they're almost like been injected into hiring managers that they feel they have to ask them, and
Huh?
people are prepared for them. Well, then going to so that's one aspect. The other aspect is those who are going for interviews. Interviews are not easy, but they're not going to go away. I don't care how advanced AI might get when it comes down to it, somebody is going to work with somebody. They've got to interview each other either face to face or virtually. And so I also hope that the candidates will get something out of this on how to better answer questions and how to what is the authenticity of being honest will give them a position where they'll be happy, not just make money. So I hope we can address both of those. So it benefits both the hiring manager and the candidate.
Beautiful. I love that. So I guess we can begin. So I'm going to be preparing for an interview, and you're going to interview me. So where do we begin?
We begin. Thank you for coming in for the interview today. I really appreciate it. Let's get
Yeah.
into it. Let's start with the question of what are your strengths, Lisa?
Well, I work really well under pressure. I am really motivated, and I work really well in a team environment, well organized, and I come from a small town and I was brought up to work really, really hard. And so you can count on me. I'll be on time. I'm gonna be showing up every day, and I'm really eager to learn.
That sounds great. But on the other hand, what are some of the areas that either people you work with or your manager would tell me are your opportunities for development or your weaknesses?
Mm, Probably being really hard on myself. And so I typically work really, really hard and strive for perfectionism, which can be a strength, but also a really big weakness. Um, so I think that would be the biggest one.
Okay, so let's take a time out and analyze what you just said because they
Okay.
both sound great and they're classic. And
Yeah.
people are now going on AI and asking AI, how do I answer these questions? And AI would come up with something very similar. But
Yeah.
what did I learn from that other than you come from a small town? Does it mean that you came from a small town that you have a good work ethic? Or there people from small towns that don't have good work ethics? You say you're well organized, You say you're on time, but you also know that's what I want to hear. But I have
Yeah.
no proof that that's true. And you did a very good job with the weakness because I'm a perfectionist, and who doesn't like a perfectionist? I mean, a perfectionist, that's great. I can deal with that. All right. So that's what people do. They turn their weaknesses into strengths, and their strengths are, in both cases, I don't know if they're true or not. They might be. But reality is, you, the candidate, are telling me what I want to hear or what you
Yeah.
think I want to hear. As a result of that, excuse me, sorry about
Bless
that.
you.
Result of that, people actually believe it because you say it with passion, you say it with conviction, you have a good tone in your voice. So I'm giving you the benefit of the doubt because I have bias. You walk into the room, you look good, you sound good, you seem prepared, you're confident. So therefore, and maybe I'm from a small town also, which I am, but therefore that's okay. We have something in common. None of that matters as far
Hmm.
as predicting your success. So my word of advice to those who are going in for interviews is to do exactly what you did. My word of advice to those who are hiring is never, ever use that question
Mm.
because it doesn't tell you anything. That question is a waste of time. Now, my other favorite question is, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Well,
Mm.
I knew where I was going to be in 5 years. I might know where I want to be. I might know where other people want me to be in 5 years. But in reality, I don't know if tomorrow I'm going to win the lottery. I don't know if
Hmm.
tomorrow their job is going to come up, which is more interesting. I don't know if I am going to change my mind and want to pursue a different career.
Which is
I
something you
want
don't say in an interview.
no, but you don't want to say any of that. But also that would be honest. But you
Yeah.
don't. Some people aren't honest. They say, "Oh, I see myself in growing in the position and advancing and becoming more knowledgeable in the field and all that stuff." But it doesn't mean anything because that's just what they're saying. It
Hmm.
doesn't mean that that's what they want to do. Plus the fact, if I look at their resume and I see they've had two separate careers, okay, already, I don't know if they're going to stay here for more than 5 years. And right
Hmm.
now, the statistics say that most people that are entering the workforce, if they can find a job, will probably change jobs within 2 to 5 years anyhow. So,
Hmm.
what do you do to prevent that from happening? Because you want to hire somebody who's going to stay there a long time. So, you got to hire somebody who fits your organization's culture, which we'll talk about later, and also fits your organization's purpose. Because once they feel they fit the culture, they fit the purpose, they're contributing to something bigger than themselves, they're going to
Hmm.
stick around a long time. So let's go to another question now. This is a fun question which people used to ask. It's not as asked as much as anymore that they used to ask, but um, on your way to the interview this morning, you drove by a number of places because to get here, you had to go through the suburbs. How many pink garage doors did you see?
Okay, that's interesting. So I saw one.
One. Good makeup because there aren't any. See,
Okay.
now the other question, which was used for years, is how many ping pong balls or marbles or something can fit into a 42-seat school bus?
Oh my God, me and numbers and figuring that out are terrible. I've never been good at those guessing games where they have jars full of pennies and you have to guess how many are in there.
Yeah.
I wouldn't even have a clue on where to start. A 48-seat yellow school bus? Oh my God. I don't know, millions.
Yeah. Well, here's the problem. It doesn't matter because it's not a relevant question.
Yeah.
It's not a relevant question to your thinking skills. It throws you off. It like all of us, especially you and I, who are math challenged, might find that a very difficult one to think through. Well, what's the square footage or inches of the school bus that's not occupied, and how many ping pong balls fit into a square foot, and then
Yeah.
multiply that out, and we can figure it out. Maybe they want to understand if you know the logic behind something, but it's a question that's not relevant. The other question, which I call the Barbara Walters question, was the one that she would ask all the movie stars when she did the her interviews for the leading contenders for the Oscars before the Oscar show is, what tree would you be if you could be a tree?
Okay.
And or I know a senior executive that he would ask the question, what vegetable would you be? And if the person says something which was everybody thinks is a vegetable, but it's really a fruit, he would say, well, that's, to himself, well, they don't know. That would be a knockout question for him. And my favorite one of how people make decisions around hiring that have no relevance to the job is a CEO that used to take out his senior candidates for dinner, and if they put salt on the food before they tasted it, he figured they weren't a risk taker and he wouldn't hire them. Uh, the
Wow.
pro the problem was is that the search firm had figured that out, so it told everybody not to put salt on the food. So all of a sudden, he thought that the search firm was doing a better job of finding better candidates because nobody was salting their food.
Wow.
I actually gave that example once at a conference. Somebody came up to me and said, "Oh, you know my CEO," and so those are questions which you got to think. You got to ask questions that you have a finite amount of time. And you got
Hmm.
to find out, does the person have the skill, the knowledge, the experience, perhaps the certification or education, and do they have the behaviors that are going to make them successful? Now, today's marketplace, we're looking at skills. Everybody's talking about skills, hiring for skills again. Here's the problem. Skills make you capable to do the job. I can do the job. Behaviors say, will you do the job?
Hmm.
So it's competencies, it's capability times behavior equals competency. Competency to do the job is I have the behaviors, which means I have the will, I have the attitude, I can do the job. And the skills is I have the competence to do the job, I have the capability to do the job. So the problem is a lot of people, when they do their calculation of the scores, they'll say, here's the skills and knowledge. They got, let's say, 90 out of 100 on that. And then here's the behaviors. They got 20 out of 100 on that. So now they have 110.
Right.
All right. 110. That's great. Well, let's say they are low on the skills. They got a 50 and they got a 50 on the behavior. So they have 100. So is that 100 better than the 110? And the way I've learned to look at, I used to think of it because I am math challenged. I used to put up an equation that says skills plus behaviors equals competency. And
Right.
one, I was doing this with a bunch of MBA students, and one young man came up to me and says, "You got the equation wrong." And I said, "Okay, what do you mean by that?" And he says, "It's a times. It's skills times behaviors equals competency. Because if you are zero on behavior, it doesn't matter how good you are at being able to do the job, you won't do it."
Hmm.
And he was so right.
Hmm.
So think of it as an equation. Think of it, do they have enough of the skills times the behaviors? Do they have the score? Because the person at 50-50 versus 10-90, the person at 50-50 is going to do a hell of a lot better. And so think of it that way in order to find out, does this person really have the fit to the job? So that's, you know, to me, why we have to look at it. Now, so people are going to say, okay, so how do I find it? So they're going to ask you a question. And the question, let's say, tell me, it is common for us to have, you're going into a manager position, and because we have a very diverse workforce. People come from different places, different backgrounds, and often there's tension in the workplace. Tell me how you would work with people from different cultures, different backgrounds. If there was tension, what would you do in order to improve upon the situation, get people work together?
Mm. I've actually been asked this one before. So I would speak to each individual individually, and then I would get the people that have tension between them into a room together and sit down and facilitate a conversation because the human on human aspect seems to diffuse conflict versus if you don't have them speak to each other.
What else we could do?
Um, I would get it like wanting to find a full understanding of where they're coming from. So yeah, maybe do a little bit of research into their cultures, perhaps. Talk to the rest of the team.
So you talk to the rest of the team, you'd find a little bit about their culture, you talk to them, and then what would happen then?
Then I would put them in a room together. If there was a conflict between two or more people, I would get them in a room together so we could have a discussion to talk about the conflict, to see what is actually happening.
Good answer. I mean, the problem is it's all would have, could have, or should have. There's
Mm,
no evidence that you've actually done that.
right.
And that's the problem with hypothetical or situational questions.
Hmm.
Most people we interview have already done very well at school or have had previous work experience, or even if they haven't had previous work experience, they've had life experiences where they've
Hmm.
worked in small groups, volunteer groups, where people have had differences and they can say what they, in theory, would do. It doesn't mean you've done it. My favorite example of that is a company, large manufacturing company, heavy manufacturing out in New Glasgow, Nova Scotia. And they have on every, in the safety department, they had a requirement, a skill, a certification that everybody had to pass the first aid course at St. John's Ambulance. And if
Mm,
they didn't have the certification from St. John's Ambulance, they couldn't get the job. It was a factor that was on the checklist. So I did a workshop on behavioral interviewing for the management level. They said first line supervisors are doing hiring should take it, but they'll have the option of not doing behavioral interviewing because they had previously been through another interview workshop, which was mostly skill and knowledge focused, and they felt they were doing very well. So I come to the plant one day, and this manager who very nicely but sternly said behavioral interviewing was too much time. It takes too much time. He couldn't do it. He was really successful with the traditional interviewing. Leave me alone. So
right.
he approaches me and kind of like sheepishly says, I only do behavioral interviewing now. And I said, what happened? And he said, I interviewed this young person who came in and he had the St. John's ambulance certification. It was recent. I asked him a few hypothetical questions of what he would do. And then I get a phone call at 2:30 in the morning from the plant, the overnight shift. There'd been an accident. And I get up, I go to work, I see what's going on, and everything seemed to be okay. Somebody had done something that ripped apart part of their arm in one of the machines because they weren't being safe. And I thought that I had the St. John's ambulance person there. That'd be great. And I looked around and he wasn't there. And I said, what happened? They said, well, we actually had two accidents. So and so was injured, and so, the St. John's ambulance, the safety guy, passed out when he saw so much blood.
Oh my gosh.
So I said, wait a second. What do you mean? He said, yeah, he passed out. I never asked them, have you, describe a recent time you've been in a situation where there was a significant injury that included a lot of blood. He would have told me he passed out, but I didn't know that. So I said, why did this happen? Why, like supposedly the response was so immediate, the guy's arm was saved. They said that summer student who cleaning the floor and doing some other stuff, he did it. He was the one who responded instantaneously and did all the right things. So I said to
Wow.
the first aid guys, the first responders, I said, like, what do you do? They explained. I went over to them and I asked them, I said, why did you knew what to do. I never even thought of asking you in the interview, but how did you learn that? And he says, it's Nova Scotia. We have hunting season and fishing season. They're two seasons. I've been going out since I'm like 10 years old, my family. That was a minor injury. I knew exactly what to do. He
Right.
says, I only ask behavioral questions now. I don't care
Hmm.
if you have the certification or don't have the certification. Tell me about a recent time where you had to deal with a violent injury that caused bodily harm. And he said, 99% of the people who have first aid certification have never dealt with it. So I don't know how they're actually going to respond in that situation. And the other,
Right.
so I always ask, like I ask when we talk about this at an interview course I teach, I talk about how many of you have first aid training, how many of you have CPR. So if you were shopping in the mall and somebody fell down and was having a heart attack, would you jump in and help them out? Because you know it in theory, but when you have to do it, especially with a total stranger, to save their life, will you do it? And I
Hmm.
get a lot of, well, now that you think about it, maybe not. So it's about, have you actually done it versus what do you do in theory?
Hmm.
Theory is great, but it's better than not knowing what to do at all. So in the research of the differences, types of interview questions, the traditional interview question, which is just what are your likes, dislikes, what do you want to be when you grow up, et cetera, et cetera. Those kinds of questions only give you about 13% of the information you need to make an accurate hire. Situational questions improve that significantly to about 35%. Behavioral questions increase that, depending on the quality of the behavioral question, anywhere between 53 and 70% of the
Hmm.
information you need. Now, behavioral interviewing is not perfect. You're going to make mistakes, but it gives you odds that if I was a gambling person, I'd rather bet with 70% in my favor than 13% in my favor. So let's go to the next question, see how we do. Um, Now, tell me about a recent time when you were working with somebody who was preventing the team from making progress.
Interesting. Um, I was working with a person in a team environment. I actually used to work with St. John Ambulance. I ran their therapy dog program for a really long time in my city. And so I'm pulling an example from there. And we had a group activity, but one person felt really kind of know-it-all like and didn't want to give anyone else essentially the floor to speak their profession and to lead in their own way. So it was like someone who was really, I guess I want to say egotistical, that was preventing the team from shining because they needed to be the center of attention.
So what happened next? What happened? That's the situation. What was if I were a fly in the wall watching your behavior, watching your actions, what do I see you doing?
So I went and spoke to each person and took lead of the situation and got everyone kind of to participate in their own way by taking control of the environment. And then I spoke to that person and made them aware of what they were doing. Because it turned out, weren't even aware of what they were doing. They were just so used to taking control of situations, being in a leadership type role. So, yeah, just gaining that better understanding, I feel really helps.
When you approach that person, how do you approach them?
When I approach that person, well, I approach them very kind, like, but assertive. So I pulled them out to another room so I could talk to them in private.
And what was the reaction?
They were a little shocked, a little embarrassed. There was a little bit of shame, but also, just like someone's a little guarded.
So how do you get past it? What do you do next?
And so we just discussed it, and I talked to them about maybe they couldn't see their own behavior, and that's why I'm here as the group leader to help everyone function as a team. And I normalized it and just made them feel like they didn't do anything wrong, but I acknowledged that in order to be successful we need to make some changes.
And what happened the next time there was a meeting, a group meeting?
The next time there's a group meeting, um, everything was a little bit awkward, but like moving towards success. So we slowly started changing the way things went. But the situation didn't diffuse in that moment. It was like a continuous. So we had to continue to work on it.
And if I wanted to, in the beginning of the interview, we told you that there might be times that we want references from within the stories in order to validate it from their perspective, what you did. Could you make, please, an arrangement for me to talk to this individual that you helped?
No, he disappeared. I'm just kidding. Yes, absolutely.
What reaction did you get from the team members?
What reaction did I get from the team members? The team members were really grateful. Like they really felt seen. And because before then, this person would make them feel like they were invisible just because of their presence. So yeah, it was impactful.
Okay, so that's a question with behavioral answers. How do you feel
Mm,
about how do you feel about that and your internal feeling about answering that versus the one about likes and dislikes and how many ping pong balls and what would you
okay.
do if? What's going on inside of you comparing your answer to the behavioral question versus the previous questions?
Hmm. Yeah, that makes a big difference because those are all, like you said, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what my best strengths are. If I'm not going to behave that way in this office setting, then it's pointless. It's useless.
And I know I threw you off, but how did it feel when I said to you, I'd like to speak to that person?
Well, in my mind, if I was lying, you would have caught me in that lie. So I was confident because I was telling you the truth, but I could see how someone who could be really good at making up a scenario could be caught in their lie. So you hold that is holding someone accountable to what they're saying in order to see if they are being honest about things. So that would also give someone an opportunity to, if they did say no, I'd be curious to know why they're saying no.
Yeah, and I call that the honesty factor question.
Hmm.
How true is that story? I have heard from clients actually in interviews I've done when I asked that honesty factor question, I've heard they moved away, I've lost contact with them. I heard that they've died. The only answer I haven't heard yet, I can't tell you because they're in the witness protection program. Um,
Right.
you do hear it, and then all of a sudden you say, so what really happened?
Yeah.
Now, it's interesting because
But
A
isn't the
lot.
interview essentially over if you catch someone in a lie? Or do you like, unless they're able to explain it? I mean, I know if I was interviewing someone and I caught them in lie after lie after lie, in my mind, I would just want them out of my office.
Yeah, you would want them out of the office, but you got to be polite. You see, the interview, what people don't understand, the interview is a reflection on the environment of the job. It's about your brand. It's about your company's, the employee brand, the employer brand, the employee brand is actually being transmitted to the candidate. Onboarding doesn't start the first day on the job. Onboarding starts with how you advertise the job, the wording you put into the job advertisement. So
Right.
you're onboarding now. That person might go on to Glassdoor and put a comment about the quality of the interview. If in fact I get really rude after, by accusing them of lying and all this other stuff, I might find out that it's all of a sudden on Glassdoor that the interviewers at this company are really rude. They're
Right.
inconsiderate and accuse you of lying. I don't want that up there. So you've got to maintain your cool. You've got to maintain your emotional intelligence the entire time throughout the
And
entire
interviews are
interview process.
nerve-wracking. People get really nervous.
And people do get nervous. And here's one that which I found fascinating. When my oldest son was in undergraduate school at University of Western Ontario, the public schools were having problems finding aides for lunchroom monitoring, and the after-school programs had been cut drastically. So he decided that a fraternity activity was the his fraternity brothers would go into the school, help with after-school programs, go in and help with monitoring lunches, and it got local television, radio, everybody was like saying how wonderful it is that the students are helping the community and everything else. In talking with his friends afterwards, I would say I know two people that use that experience as if they were the ones who were leading it on medical school applications. I know other students who told me, those friends said they use that story as if it was theirs in interviews, but it wasn't theirs.
Hmm.
So if the interviewer said, "Gee, that was really great, the television, the local TV, could I get a copy of that?" Well, if they did, they'd find out it wasn't them, it was somebody else. So,
Right.
it's a great story. It really makes you feel good that that student who is leading this initiative really is invested in the community, wants to give back. You want to hire them. But if I don't ask that question, like, what was the reaction of your fraternity brothers? How'd you overcome their resistance? Or, that's really great. I'd love to talk to the school principal about, how you approach them and what was the actual event, because college students can back out on things. Nobody ever asked that.
Hmm.
So you can turn somebody else's story. I was doing work with Calgary Police, and they were using this process in the promotional process. And when I talked about people using other stories, they said, "Well, the police service only has 1,400 officers, sworn officers, and if one catches a cold, they all catch a cold. So we know what each other's doing. They're not going to be able to lie to us because we know what's going on." But yet
Right.
some of those going in for promotional interviews still borrowed stories from other officers. And of
Hmm.
course they got caught. So people want the job. They're going to tell you what you think you want to hear. They think you want to hear. They're not going to tell you necessarily what they did. So that's why that honesty question, which really is powerful,
Hmm.
is is so important to it's not the behavior that see, because the behavioral question I asked you, if you look on the surface, you might say it was about team building, but really it was about communications and relationship building.
Right.
What are the behaviors I'm looking for there? So here's the key to the interview process if you're doing behavioral interviews. You got to know what you're looking for before you start the interview. Because somebody who is confident, articulate, expresses themselves extremely well, they can baffle you, but with a great answer and say, wow, that was a great answer. Even though none of those behaviors are relevant to the job. They're not
Mm-hmm.
how we behave at our work, but they were good for whatever you're doing. They're not a good fit. You need to define in advance. I'm looking for somebody for teamwork is not good enough. I'm looking for somebody who builds relationships. I'm looking for a good salesperson. No, that's not enough. I need to know what are the 4 or 5 critical behaviors of a salesperson in our organization. What are the critical team building behaviors in our organization? What's relationship building look like? How does one communicate? I have to list those out, and then I have to be able to use that as my anchor against which, what did you say? If they match, then you get points for it. Now, here's the other part. I didn't ask you a very important question. When was that experience of the story? When did that happen? What year?
Oh, okay. I guess that would have been 2 years ago, 2025, 2024.
Okay,
So which
so
year is it?
that's
Yeah,
within
2020.
okay, so that's within the last 2 years, which
Yes.
means it's relevant
Mm,
because people believe that past behavior, past performance predicts future behavior, future performance. It's not true. We were all different people than we were in high school. We're different
hmm.
than we were even 10 years ago. Once you have kids or don't have kids, things change. Once you have experiences at work, once, sometimes there's a tragedy in your family and it changes your behavior that somebody who knew you a long term time ago might get surprised by. So, what is recent behavior that's frequently demonstrated? So,
Hmm.
I need to know that that behavior was within the last 2 years. So
Hmm.
I said, I'm looking for skills, knowledge, education, behavior, experience, and time frame. What is the time frame that happened? Because if it happened 10 years ago, likelihood is why haven't you done it since?
Yeah.
Great story, but I'm looking for some. So if I have 2 candidates and they both give me great stories which match the behaviors I'm looking for, I want to hire the candidate that's done it recently,
Hmm.
even if I like the other candidate better. And we all have to, and I think one of the biggest problems we have in interviews is everybody talks about bias-free interviews.
Yeah,
It's
I was just gonna ask
impossible.
you about that.
It's impossible. We can't have bias-free interviews. I ask at the interview course that I teach, I ask, what kind of car do I drive? And everybody gives me an answer. Usually never right, because I drive a 2005 Volvo S40. They
Okay.
all think I have a new high-end car because it goes with the profession, it goes with whatever, but that's their bias.
Hmm.
Our bias is based on how we've experienced life and what we anticipate those experiences in other people will lead to. I
Hmm.
believe a car's to get you safely from point A to point B.
Yeah.
I don't care about the car. All right. I mean, I care about the car works, but I know where the gas goes, I know where the ignition is, and I know where the repair shop is. But I don't, beyond that, that's nice. So we all have our prejudice. We all have some people, believe this is like shocks me, but some people believe that if you're older and bald or have gray hair, you're probably a good leader.
Right.
People have researched that tall people are usually hired over shorter people.
Interesting.
So I'm always, people joke about it that with video interviewing, my advantage of being 6'3" has suddenly disappeared because we're all sitting down now. So I said, oh yeah, I guess I took that prejudice away. That's too bad.
Right.
So, it's, people have all sorts of prejudice. If they're not wearing polished shoes, how can I judge
Totally.
them? Or their hair's not neat. Now, here's an interesting one. I'm working with one of the major hospitals in New York City, and
Okay.
I was asked to teach the physicians who are interviewing uh, a significant number of people for a program, MDs for a program. I asked them to, they asked me to teach them behavioral interviewing, and I did. And I followed up a couple of weeks later with them, and I got a very interesting response. They were prejudiced against those people that came in who were not wearing a suit and tie. They were all wearing very expensive suits and ties.
Right.
And I said, that person came across the street from that hospital after they were done with surgery, going back to do another surgery. Do they really have time to change in their suit and tie? And does it
Mm-hmm.
really matter once you have your scrubs on anyhow? And they, all of a sudden they were embarrassing because their prejudice was showing that at a certain level of being a physician, you should be wearing a suit and tie and properly dressed and all this stuff. And I said, it doesn't matter to me as the patient if they wore a suit and tie at their interview. It
Mm-hmm.
matters to me how they're, their bedside manner, how they're going to behave, perform in the operation. And,
Mm-hmm.
I had to point that out to them. And suddenly they saw doctors who probably were not being considered because of that initial gut reaction. Now, when I was in education and doing research as part of my graduate program, we were asking teachers about how they formed opinions about students. And they formed opinion about students either before the student ever entered the classroom based on what other teachers had said about the student or about their academic records. And they therefore felt if you were a B student, you're going to be a B student with them. If you're a C student, you're going to be a C student with them. And therefore, they didn't put enough energy into making a C student an A student.
Right.
So you have to be able to take away what you've heard about that, and you have to be honest. So if I have a list of behaviors, I have a list of skill and knowledge that is necessary to do the job, and I measure that behavior against what I want, then I've lowered the bias margin. So
Mm-hmm.
in the book, Selecting the Best, I actually have this story of a case study of the plant that was opening in Corpus Christi, Texas. And one of the very first interviews that the general manager made, of course, they were hiring people with engineering backgrounds. And so going through the first set of interviews, he comes to me and says, I think I'm going to recommend somebody that before this process I would not have recommended. And I said, what do you mean? He said, he doesn't have the engineering certification I want. He has engineering background in other areas, but his behaviors blew me away. So I'm going to hire him. And because of the setup, he will have time to learn the skill and knowledge necessary to do that job. And I'll help him and make sure he does. And two
Right.
years later, he was the best employee he had. But when he reflected upon it, he said, if I was going strictly by skill and knowledge, I would have never hired this guy. But putting the behavior component against our values, he was the best candidate that was out there. He was the best option I had. And it turned out he was the best option he had. So we have to be able to be objective and say, does this person have the criteria? Now, the other
Mm-hmm.
thing is my pet peeve, which I am really always concerned about, is when I see these job postings and they say minimum 5 years experience, minimum 7 years experience in such and such. And I'm saying, wait a second. So I relate it to the movie Groundhog Day. You can have a candidate who's been on the job 10 years, who has 1 year's experience repeated 10 times.
Right.
Or you can have a candidate with 2 years experience and the wisdom and knowledge of 10 years experience.
Mm-hmm.
The only way you're going to know that is through the behaviors and through the stories they tell in the behaviors and the
Mm-hmm.
repetition and the frequency of those behaviors. So I, unless, you know, years experience is actually proves something, I really am on this crusade to get rid of years experience off of these job descriptions, off these postings. The other one is degrees. So I was working with this same company out in Halifax, in Nova Scotia, in New Glasgow, and they had a young man come in from Poland. And because his engineering degree had to be sort of transcribed into Canadian equivalency, he had to go to TONS, the New Nova Scotia School of Engineering, to get it certified. And it turned out it was only certified as a technical degree, not an engineering degree. But at the interview, he was like the best candidate.
Right.
So, but because the job description said must have an engineering degree, they looked for an engineer who they found and fired 6 months later.
Right.
Reclassified the job for technical degree, hired this person who came in and did a phenomenal job and solved problems that this other guy struggled with for 6 months. He solved in the next 3 months. So is that degree absolutely necessary? Obviously, if it's a surgeon, you want somebody who's got the license. If they're an airline pilot, you want somebody with the license and probably some experience. But those are not always absolutes in jobs. I was working with a pharmaceutical company, and they had just put out a new product in association with a company in Europe, and the company was out of Texas. And the pharmaceutical sales reps, they always like to hire experienced pharmaceutical sales reps, but they had to hire 100 of them. And I said, let me do a behavioral profile and find out what are the behaviors your best salespeople are demonstrating out there. And they put a behavioral interview process together. And I forgot about that work. And then one day, my um, to be daughter-in-law came to me. She was doing her MBA program. They had an HR assignment. They needed to do a case study on something never been done before. I said, call up the gentleman in Texas that I worked with and find out how that turned out.
Right.
Because they hired only recent grads against all predictions that they'd work out. They hired 100 of them. And he said the only problem they had is those that came from rural backgrounds, suburbia rural backgrounds, when they put them in sales to do sales work in the city, they were struggling. When they put people from the city into farming areas, they were struggling. So they switched them to the geographic locations they were comfortable with. All 100 were still there 3 years later.
Wow.
And the drug had a phenomenal success. So I kind of smiled and said, see, this stuff does work,
Mm-hmm.
because they had the behaviors to do the job. And those behaviors were very specifically defined. And we did that with another drug company as well that had a similar kind of experience. So the fact is that I can take that bias away from you as long as you have the rigor. The only way to have the rigor is to do panel interviews to make sure that three people interview at the same time, hear the same story in the same way, take notes individually, score it on their own according to their rubric that's created, and then come back and compare notes. And only no, it has to be through consensus, not voting, because the person who's the odd person out might actually have heard the story and have the evidence to convince the other two they didn't hear it right. And I've seen that happen. So it's really important to have panel interviews. It shortens the time of the interview. The person doesn't have to come back for a second or third interview. You shorten the time, people get hired faster. There's a quicker time to productivity. So those are some of the things that a behavioral interview will increase. When you're hiring against the values of the organization, it makes it even stronger because we as human beings, when our values get violated, we get upset. So if I want to hire somebody that gets along in our organization, can argue with everybody, but knows that they have more or less the same values, so they get along. It's a honest disagreement, difference of opinion, but it's just a difference of opinion about how to proceed with something. It's not a difference of opinion or a conflict of values. And if I can hire somebody that has a vision like our organization's vision, a purpose like our organization's purpose, then they feel that they're contributing to something bigger than themselves. And as human beings, that's what we want to do. We want to contribute to something that goes beyond ourselves. So if I can hire people that fit that equation, I'm going to have people that are motivated, retained, productive, and innovative, and help us be successful. So that's why it's not just behavioral interviewing, it's behavioral interviewing against a criteria behavior that are rooted in the organization's culture and the purpose of the organization. And when I can find that person will be really successful.
Hmm. Thank you so much. What a brilliant conversation. I know we didn't get to touch on AI, but I think that's something that we could cover in a future episode. I want to know if hiring managers listening today could change just one thing about their interview process. What would you tell them?
I would say know what you're looking for before the interview starts and
Yeah,
judge the person based on their recent behavior against the criteria that you define, and don't modify your perception of the person because you like them. Stick to these are the criteria that lead to success. This is the criteria that if I hire them, they're going to make me successful, and stick with it.
yeah, amazing. Thank you so much for being here, David. Can you tell everyone just a little bit more about what you do? I know we're going to put it in the show notes, but just quickly.
Yeah, I work with organizations on defining what their authentic culture is, behaviors around that culture, how to integrate that with all aspects of talent management. And the book behind you, Selecting the Best, is a understanding of how to identify the authentic behaviors of the authentic values, and how to apply that to a structured behavioral interviewing program.
Amazing. So thank you so much again for being here. It was so much fun talking to you.
Always. Thank you very much.
And to our audience, thank you for being here. So, what did you learn today? I know for me, I learned that interviews should not be like a theater. They should be a conversation focused on behaviors. People can say whatever they want, but what is the evidence to back that up? How is someone going to actually act in the moment? If you enjoyed what you heard today, please leave comments in the comment section. We do read them and we do get back to you. And we will make sure to have David's information in the show notes for you to have access to him, his books, his tools, and more of what he does. Thank you for tuning in. We look forward to the next episode. Until next time, bye everyone.